Here's what's great also about public health. Like our tools for amplifying benefits and minimizing harms are really not restricted to journeys themselves and the before and after of journeys. That's like obviously a critical component. But again, like the number one side effect of working with psychedelics is change in relationship.
Welcome to Intonicated, a podcast about psychedelics, learning, and well-being. Intonicated is an adjective that describes a heightened, expansive, and health-affirming state of consciousness marked by clarity, vitality, and integration, in which a person feels inwardly attuned and stretched towards deeper awareness, emotional resonance, or spiritual growth. I'm your host, Ken Tupper. Please be sure to like or subscribe.
Okay, welcome to Intonicated, a podcast about psychedelics, learning, and well-being. And joining me today is my friend and colleague, Heather Kuiper from the Center for Psychedelic Public Health. Heather, do you want to introduce yourself a bit more fully?
Yeah, hi. It's great to be with you, one of my favorite conversationalists. And so I'm really happy to be here today and to get to share about our work and about psychedelics, one of our favorite topics. So I am director and co-founder of the Center for Psychedelic Public Health. Our mission is to amplify the benefits of psychedelics while minimizing harms for family, community, population, and planetary health. And so where we stand out from other good organizations in this space is really focusing at that collective level. And we're guided by some key pillars of promoting equity and community and safety and right relations with Indigenous knowledge and well-being that we see as really fundamental to creating a strong container for good practice.
Excellent. Well, and you've got a background in public health professionally before you got interested in the psychedelic space. Can you speak more just about your general background in public health?
Yeah, sure. Well, public health is a huge field, and a lot of times people don't know what it is because if it's doing its job, it's preventing illness and injury and premature mortality, and it's protecting populations and protecting their health and safety, and it's promoting wellness. And so if people are feeling good and not getting sick, they don't think about public health because it's doing its job. It, of course, is a field that became quite visible during the pandemic and also quite politicized, which is unfortunate because it's really mostly dedicated to the public benefit and well-being. So in that large field, I've worn many different hats. Some of the classic areas I've worked in are maternal child health and reproductive health and international community development. And then I've moved into other more emerging fields at the time. So I've also worked in, for example, health and the built environment. And so I've worked with how health departments can influence land use and transportation development. And then right before really going both feet in with psychedelics, I was working around fossil fuels, environmental justice, and public health. So my own career gives a sense of the span of the field. And then I've worked in the public sector and the academic sector and the nonprofit sector, worked with communities directly, worked for communities through systems and infrastructure. And so, it's a different route. Some people will pick one area and really go deep in it. And I am an intersectionalist. And so what I find is that really informs the approach to psychedelics. They've come onto the scene really through, in particular, mental health and addiction issues, which is great and really important, but there are so many other applications. And so this way of taking a very broad and interdisciplinary and multi-sector approach, I think, is something that public health can contribute. And that background is what really informs my work at this time.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Obviously, I agree. So, can you tell me about how you got into psychedelics as a topic for the public health lens to be applied to? Like,
Yeah.
what was your sort of inspiration to bring those two areas together?
Yeah, right. Because it hasn't been really happening. I mean, well, you've been one of the leaders and early thinkers and contributors in this field. The field is still catching up with that thinking. So I would say I'm kind of a late bloomer with psychedelics. In fact, I really stayed clear of them through my understanding of what was healthy and not healthy. I'm from the just say no and this is your brain on drugs era. And pre-dare, but it still has left its mark. And so my own misunderstanding of these substances and what's possible with them informed me not having much experience with them until later. I was 50 when I first really turned to this world and understanding it. And from the outset, it became really clear to me that the properties of psychedelics and the pathways of psychedelics are inherently collective. There's also obviously a huge critical role for the individual and that individual psychospiritual process and pathway. But this collective piece really fascinated me and caught my interest, in part because I am a public health professional and we work at the collective level. We work through population dynamics and social transmission models and infrastructure and policy and systems. And so from the get, I just felt like these two things need a mashup. And there's something really powerful that can come through them in both directions. So how public health can really come and help as we're dedicated to amplify the benefits of what's possible. Not everybody needs to have a direct experience for us to change a population or to change a community through these if we understand the collective pathways of them. And then similarly, I am really fascinated by how psychedelics can change how we practice public health. So that's another area of exploration for us.
Yeah, and you led a publication, I remember, that came out, was it a year and a half ago, looking at schools of public health and what attention they were paying or not. I think it was mostly based in the
Yeah.
US, but can you speak
Yeah.
to what you did by way of that research and what you found?
Yeah, that was a great project. And it one of the things that was impactful about it is that it served as a calling card and as one of our co-founders, Missy Woldridge, says, it's like a caca, like who's out there, sort of some echolocation. So, in public health methodology, one of the first things you do is an assessment of what's already going on. Like we really specialize in community-based care and community-based processes. And so you start by saying what's up with the community. You don't just go in with your solution. You listen first to what the needs are and what the assets are and plan and proceed accordingly. And so in that spirit, the first step was to say, well, what's going on? Is there any activity already linking public health and psychedelics? And that's, of course, where came across your work, and the Canadian Public Health Association did a 2-day forum on psychedelics and public health. And so we started with a really broad scan of anyone doing collective level work in the space, and if they are, do they intentionally bring public health tools and frameworks to the table for that work? And that is one of those to be finished another day, really interesting foray into that space. And we did see activity going on in the collective level, which is actually growing, but again, not with a lot of public health intentionality behind it. And so we just decided to scope to something that was easily parameterized. And so we went to look at universities that had accredited schools of population and public health and in US accredited. So you're right, the schools were mostly US based, a few globally situated. And we looked at, in those university settings, is the public health school involved? And if they are involved, how involved are they? And we didn't have a very high bar for involvement. So we found
How many schools did you
yeah.
how many schools did you sample, or did you were
There
able to
were
look at?
228. Yeah, 228 schools and programs. And so we saw about 10% had any, and this was all an internet search with, the accompanying limitations of that. And so for what it's worth, though, looking pretty carefully through all the web pages in the affiliated programs, we found about 10% had sort of any mention of psychedelics, but then really only about 3% had a substantive engagement where they were doing more than just writing a newsletter. There was also somebody maybe doing some research or hosting an event, doing more than one thing. And then that was in contrast to looking at the universities themselves and what was going on. And we found about half of them had some sort of activity around psychedelics and about a quarter of them in a substantive way. And so it really showed the gap that public health not at the table and not leading in this space, despite the tremendous possibilities for promoting health and wellness and dealing with some of the most intractable public health challenges that we're facing right now.
And what was the
But
impact
there's,
of
oh yeah,
the paper you guys published, and then you presented, I believe, at Psychedelic Science 2025? What sort of
yeah,
reverberations have you seen from that work?
yeah. Well, one of our main strategies is to do movement building. I'm really informed by the doctoral work that I did around how health departments could influence land use and transportation development. And that was housed within a movement at that time in the early turn of the millennium to see healthy built environments as a new area of public health. And they took a disciplinary approach where you need a common language and principles of practice and technical support pathways. And so we're really informed by that. And we recognize that what we're doing is creating a new discipline within public health and also within psychedelics. And so we're approaching it as a psychedelic public health as a new discipline. There's psychedelic medicine, there's psychedelic psychotherapy, there's psychedelic law, and so on. And so we're taking that same discipline building approach to public health. And so this publication, which we published in Social Science and Medicine, which is a very established public health journal, it was an intentional destination versus some of the outstanding psychedelic journals that are doing a lot of publication there, because we're really working on accessing the bread and butter core systems, institutions of public health, because there's enormous power and multiplying impacts that can happen from that. So from a movement building approach, yes, we've been able to share this through some of the big institutional events like Psychedelic Science, but then also at the American Public Health Association. So in 2023, with one of their sections, I co-hosted what may be the first ever, and certainly the first since Prohibition, event on psychedelics and public health at the annual meeting of the American Public Health Association. And with almost no advertising, we had 150 people come through the door and high level of engagement and interest. And then the next year, in 2024, they held their first scientific panel on the topic. And then last year they had their second scientific panel, and we contributed 2 of the 3 talks in 24 and 4 of the 8 talks in 2025. So that's just by one metric to see it growing. And then also to see, I've only been to 2 of the psychedelic science conferences, but by another measure, what do you see there? In 2023, I went specifically to look at who's doing what at a collective level, who's speaking to that. And there was, of course, Elliot Mersai's work around group practices with ketamine. There was a presentation on raves and a presentation on dance and collective dance forms, but not much. And then fast forward to 2025, they're referencing the Colorado policy as a public health policy. There's a global public health workshop and panel. So we really are seeing an acceleration of the language. So that's where we turn now to, like, let's get that grounded. Let's define that through the expertise of people who sit at that intersection of public health and psychedelics.
And you talked about public health broadly having the agenda of trying to prevent illness or disease or harms, I guess, and on the other hand, promoting wellness, promoting health. Those are 2 different strategies with respect to the use of psychedelics, again, at a population level, and also, I guess, even at an individual level. But can you speak to maybe the harm reduction side? We met actually at a psychedelic safety summit that was very much talking about those kinds of issues. And I can see potentially that's where a lot of the traction might come from mainstream public health departments so could you talk more a little bit about the harm reduction side, and then maybe we can turn to the health promotion side later.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think that the harm reduction side is like a really natural point of entry because there's so much good work that's being done in that space. I know it's become a political hot potato in some way, but it saves lives. And so really matters. And I think the place where it becomes tricky is that people are concerned that it's somehow we're promoting drug use. And it also put psychedelics in a space with other illicit substances that are also going through a political movement and efforts for deep prohibition. And so then questions of psychedelic exceptionalism arise and that sort of thing. So that's where it gets kind of tangled up. But I do think that there's just like a clear sight line that this is a really important place to go. Is we need to keep people safe. We need to, in the promotion of their well-being, we also need to protect safety and harm reduction. One of the most important things it does is destigmatize use. And stigma is such a risk factor for harm because people don't seek help when they need help when things are stigmatized. And so all the systems in the world can be at the ready, but if people can't access them through those types of barriers, we can't help. And so one of the big things is the destigmatization. But I would say moving up a notch and related is one of the highest order practices for harm reduction is to change the model. So change the policy framework from a prohibitionist one, which is about control and stigma and forcing things underground, to so we're seeing an opening of regulatory pathways, but what's it going toward? And so that's where we think there's really a role to step in and say it should go toward a public health model, which is about amplifying benefits, minimizing harms, securing equity and access. And so that policy level, I think, is really important. There's even research that is indicating that by deep prohibitionizing, I'm kind of making up that word, so to not get entangled in the details, but generally moving away from prohibition may create safer contexts for use and be, our first line harm reduction strategy. But from there, of course, it's looking at safe supply, safe settings, adequate information so that you make good decisions about practices and care. It's having drug checking resources available, in particular, like in the nightlife settings and the festival settings where there's often large scale use and young people that don't need to lose their lives for small mistakes or through unsafe access. It's interesting. I think harm reduction is also kind of an interesting field because a lot of it emerged through peer support models without the institutional support of public health, for example, of health departments. In fact, at times, those institutions working against the practices of harm reduction. And so it has a grassroots origin story that's really important to honor. And so as public health kind of comes in and formalizes their role with psychedelics and plays a role with harm reduction, it's really important to recognize that that key function of public health has been occupied by people who had to step forward in the absence of a formal public health response.
Yeah, for sure. You talked about psychedelic exceptionalism. Would you say you're a psychedelic exceptionalist? And can you unpack what you mean by that term?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. And this is a great place for us to have kind of more conversation because I heard you claiming being a psychedelic exceptionalist, and I was like, that feels good in some ways, to really honor what's distinct about these substances and to make sure we're really making space for that, even as we support health and safety for all people and destigmatize all practices. And in the name of that health and safety, there's something important that psychedelics offer that we need to be paying attention and have access to pathways and populations that are distinct and potent. And so, wanting to make sure that we don't lose those avenues for community and population level healing by being too merged with the full world of substance use. So I think it's like a yes and. I wouldn't want to leave behind the imperative of health and safety for all people and destigmatization and safety for all practices.
Yeah, I think you brought up an important point about prohibition or criminalization as, in some ways, the most deeply entrenched form of stigma. People can possess tobacco or alcohol or caffeine, which are psychoactive drugs, all, but not subject to criminal penalties for that, or at least not in Canada or the United States, if you're above legal age.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
sort of angle that I take is, needing to separate the harms from drugs, which are, I would say, psychopharmacological largely, the harms from addiction, which we often conflate with drugs, and different substances have different propensities to lead to chronic dependent patterns of use or substance use disorders, and then the harms from drug policies. And certainly in my
Yeah.
experience in the past, all of those three different kinds of harms were just muddled together in terms of people's understanding, especially political and public discourse, constructions of risk, and the ways that we should be understanding these as problems, and then obviously the solutions that we bring forward. So when I think about that separation of the harms from drugs, the harms from addictions, and the harms from drug policies, psychedelics, I would say, are a bit exceptional insofar as they don't lead to chronic dependent patterns of use. Typically, I put an asterisk beside ketamine on that one, but the classical
Yeah.
psychedelics are quite different.
Yeah.
And so obviously the movement towards understanding the harms from drug policies and all of the associated injustices, social injustices that are brought with the application of criminal penalties and policing and incarceration, especially
Yeah.
in the country where you are, need to be addressed at a systemic level. There's something about psychedelics that's a little bit different. So I don't know if you want to comment further on that, whether you're going to claim yourself as a full psychedelic exceptionalist or not.
Yeah, I couldn't put both feet in that camp. I think that even as it's important to recognize their unique properties and lean into those, because what we know is that if you don't have health for all, you don't have health for none. That we're inherently interconnected, and societies that have more injustice and more inequity by economics, by race, by gender are less healthy societies. And so from a public health perspective, you can't pick one and not the other. And I think that's what is so really important and kind of segues into the health promotion part, is that the potential for benefits and the amplification of benefits is part of what's really important in our mission, is to lean toward that. And the more we're focused on wellness and wholeness, the more the need for prevention and harm reduction will go away. So at a population scale.
And you referenced earlier, I wanted to bring this up again, is the understanding of traditional Indigenous knowledge practices as, a model for how to use these really powerful plants or substances or tools, as I sometimes characterize them, that we in the modern West, with our sort of atomistic dislocation and alienation, perhaps would benefit from, but the communities whose knowledge this originally was aren't necessarily able to partake in the, venture capitalist enterprises that are pushing all of this forward.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you can speak more with the Indigenous principles that you referenced are part of the foundation of the Center for Psychedelic Public Health.
Yeah. Yeah. So still under construction on what that means, because we want to develop a collaborative process, but aware that a few things. I think this is true in any field that we're in, but in particular for psychedelics, we really do need to be in right relationship with the knowledge systems, the stewards of those knowledge systems, and the communities themselves that at a collective level have held the stewards in the stewardship. And both on the basis of that general statement I made, that if we don't resolve health disparities, we aren't achieving a healthy society, and Native or Indigenous populations around the world are disproportionately, tremendously burdened by negative health conditions and mental health burdens. And that's just must be corrected. We have to pay attention to that. And so as we work to honor the protocol, that really means hand in hand honoring the people. So in this, as I mentioned about the field development and taking that disciplinary approach, we're really wanting to establish that by definition, psychedelic public health is integrated with Indigenous paradigms and psychedelic paradigms too. So one of the projects we are excited to get going is a project to develop that framework of what does it look like to bring the public health models and the Indigenous theories and paradigms and the psychedelic, quantum and entanglement models all together to create a good foundation of practice for psychedelic public health. And there's really a lot of natural connection because, as a generalization, as Indigenous paradigms work through an ecological, interconnected, relational, holistic worldview, so too does public health when it's practiced well. And public health has its own history of harm and harm against communities of color and eugenics movement, the Tuskegee study that, so it has its own reckoning to do. And yet when it's done well and at its kind of most beautiful form, it's taking the social ecological model of health, which embeds the individual in relational, community, organizational, policy, cultural settings and contexts. For example, dovetails really well with an Indigenous paradigm. So we think there's some natural points of connection there. And then how we run the organization, we're wanting to, we're building out our handbook and looking at, well, what do we do for conflict resolution and how can we be informed by Indigenous practices that are more about a kinship model and a relational place of resolution and deep organizational integrity around what our language is, what we, that commitment can show up in something really small, like we're working on an evaluation project and they have a survey where they ask people what languages do they speak. And we make sure that there's a box to check that you speak a native language, and so de-invisibilizing is, I think, a really important part of the work. And so as we maintain that awareness of that commitment, we can see the ways that it just infuses the work. And what did I want to
Well,
wrap with
can you
that?
comment further on,
Yeah.
you speak about language. I'm not talking about particular Indigenous languages, but the language that we use around psychedelics and the word psychedelic itself is, got its own baggage. And I know in conversations with some Indigenous peoples, they don't want their traditional sacred medicines to be categorized under the umbrella of psychedelic. Can you speak to some of the considerations that you've had to wrestle with, even just in terms of terminology that's being used by the center?
Yeah. And here's where we should definitely be in exchange because this is just such one of your gifts. And before I jump in on that, I do want to just mention also, there's these conceptual and linguistic and de-invisibilizing, which are all really important. And then there's just concrete, like fighting against biopiracy, making sure that Indigenous communities have full access to all the benefits of what's being developed in psychedelic science, as well as protection and elevation of their traditional practices, that we're in right relations around reciprocity. So there's some kind of concrete hard skill type of practices that we also want to commit to. But going back to the language, it is difficult to find one word for these amazing substances that are used in so many different ways, connected to lineage, disconnected from lineage, synthetic, naturally occurring. And we surrendered to psychedelic being the closest thing to a consensus language at this time. And when appropriate, in particular in context of speaking about Indigenous practices and traditional methods, we want to be weaving in recognition of sacred plant medicines and sacraments and that language that helps, in English in any case, that helps to expand our understanding of their role and their relationship with us. But even with psychedelics, I've been wondering, and here I should hand it over to you, but the origins of psychedelics, it's not a bad word when you look at it more completely, where the psyche is about life or breath and soul manifestation as much as mind manifestation. And for all the reasons, people have narrowed that down to say that psychedelics means mind manifesting. But it's actually, I think from the get, been much more holistic in its understanding. So we're wondering about if there's a way to raise awareness about the bigger definition of that word so that it can more harmoniously house these wider set of considerations. I wonder what do you think, like, the neologisms and creating words and bringing them to life in society? What do you think we could do with that word psychedelic to make it more holistic and encompassing?
Well, when I got involved in this formally over 25 years ago, I didn't use the word psychedelic. It was definitely kind of third rail. I found the word entheogen to be much preferable. That was also
Okay.
a new word on the scene. At least I was in the faculty of education and talking
Yeah.
about entheogenic education. And if I talked about psychedelics, psychedelic learning, psychedelics in education, I wouldn't have gotten, I think, very far. But using the term entheogenic education, and entheogen, of course, comes from Greek. Theos means God or spirit, and gen, to give birth to. So it was more resonant of the sacred traditional ceremonial uses of plants, and that was why it was coined back in I think it's late
Yeah.
70s. Um,
Yeah.
and then, of course, since then, the word psychedelic's been very much rehabilitated, but in a fairly narrowly constrained way, I'd say, in the broad public perception. And what you're describing is probably a useful endeavor to further broaden what psychedelic can mean and to recognize, yeah, psyche has resonances not just of the sort of brain and mind sort of in the
Yeah.
narrow
Yeah.
sort of within the skull kind of thing, but has broader potential
Yeah.
spiritual dimensions that need to be understood as well. So appreciate
Yeah.
that. And of course,
Yeah.
ultimately we're talking about experiences and understandings that defy language, right? We're in the realm of the ineffable. So
Yeah.
it's not surprising
Right.
that we're struggling to find words to put to it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. The words by definition create boundaries and limitations.
Yeah.
They, as much as we use them to try to create something expansive, what they are doing is by definition narrowing things. So that's interesting. Well, and you're making
I
me
mean, even
think too about, oh yeah, go ahead.
even the word drug itself is problematic. We go to a drugstore to purchase medicines, but what's a
Yeah.
medicine? That's regulated by the FDA or Health Canada or equivalency. So there's all kinds of politics around the language that we use. Sorry if I interrupted you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm glad you added that in because it's part of what I was thinking about segueing to is around education and public education. And you make a good distinction that there are different buckets of education. There's public education and professional education and formal education. And I think there's a fourth one that that you can
School-based
remind us
education,
of.
K to 12,
School-based.
post-secondary education. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so really seeing that as a very important growth area. And here's what's great also about public health. Like our tools for amplifying benefits and minimizing harms are really not restricted to journeys themselves and the before and the after of journeys. That's like obviously a critical component. But again, like the number one side effect of working with psychedelics is change in relationship. Number one, hands down. And so when we just embrace that, there's just so much that can happen that's not about the intervention doesn't need to occur approximate to a journey itself. Like it's about family systems and community dynamics. And so that's where our tools, for example, segue in with education. And so what I was thinking about is some conversations we've had about how to bring a wider lens around psychedelics at this point, if you will, into an education space and housing it, for example, in a bigger understanding of ritual and a bigger understanding of consciousness. And going back to harm reduction, back in the day, when I was in college, at the time, my university instituted a policy around ENABs, or equally attractive non-alcoholic beverages. So any campus function that was serving alcohol had to have ENABs available too. And before that, I guess they just were like, good luck with the tap water, And so there was a structural emphasis on alcohol without alternatives. And so similarly, we've been thinking about how if we understand psychedelics within this broader exercise of consciousness, suddenly there's a whole array of options that people can learn about and get curious about and have ways to start, in particular young people that might start before working directly with one of these big substances. They can look at breath work and meditation and certain forms of dance or sound baths, those types of things that are also expansive and connecting to greater elements of self and the beyond. And then housing psychedelics within that is a more ecosystem approach that just seems relevant to how we can make a bigger contribution at a population scale to how psychedelics influence society, and also then becomes like a form of harm reduction because people will not only learn that there are alternatives, but also start to understand that there's sort of a skill building process that goes with all of these as well. And so a certain amount of harm from psychedelics can be mitigated by stabilizing consciousness. And that's done through contemplative practices, for example. And so when, I think in particular around young people, as they can learn about the skills involved in safe and effective journeying, then that will keep them safer. That will also open up a wider menu of opportunities and options for them. And so that education part is important. And here I want to turn to you, because we've also talked about how important it is to understand the role, not just for healing, but also for teaching that comes through these relationships with the plants, for example, and how to expand awareness around that.
Well, yeah, that was my original entry into this whole space. Wasn't so much about the therapeutic uses of these substances, but the educational potential and the metaphor of plant teacher that I kept coming across in some of my readings, and sort of resonances with my own experiences, that there's something to be learned from these and ultimately healed. And I've done my share, I think, of that as well, a little more recently, actually, in terms of my deliberate approach to using these as therapeutic tools. But the cognitive enhancement elements are certainly part of the impetus towards researching, understanding neuroplasticity, and ways to broaden one's consciousness, one's mind, and connection, the connection to others, the family, community, ultimately other creatures that we inhabit the planet with.
Yeah,
All of
that's
those
right.
things, we can usefully, I think, understand a little bit better when deploying these with circumspection and respect. I think that's crucial, and that's the
Yeah.
harm reduction side, is like not
Yeah.
just assuming that ingesting the substance is going to magically do its. Occasionally it might, but I think there's ways to design the intentional use in such a way as to maximize
Yeah.
the potential benefits and minimize the harms. So that's,
Yeah.
I say,
Yeah.
the public health angle fits so well with where I've come
Right.
from and where you're coming in as well.
Yeah.
So can
And
you speak more to the?
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm weaving some of these things together, like the language and the harm reduction and consciousness. I'm really thinking about the language of ritual that we've talked about, and recreational, and even recreation as ritual. So not to diminish recreation at all, but when you introduce and give people access to the language of ritual, and ritual on its own is not inherently good. Like there's can be lots of bad rituals too. So it's a powerful word to kind of claim and help people understand and relate to. But when people approach and interact with these substances in a ritual way that brings in respect, for example, as a key component of that, versus something less intentional or strictly recreational, again, not to diminish the value of recreational use, but more to say that in particular, young people don't necessarily in our mainstream society have any felt experience or learn or direct experience with ritual. And so they don't feel the difference. And when they can feel and learn something about that difference, then they're able to be in choice. Which way am I working with these at this time? Or how do I take my recreational practice and bring in some of the ritual that I know will enliven it or make me safer, or that sort of thing. And I think we could take a page in that line through some really interesting work being done in tribal health contexts around smoking cessation efforts, where they've introduced language around sacred tobacco or ceremonial tobacco and commercial tobacco. And so by creating the language, you create the space to be in choice and have something to go toward, is not just something to put aside. So just thinking about your magic with words and the topic that we're talking about, I wanted to bring that in.
No, that's a really, really
Yeah.
useful understanding, and thinking of tobacco as, a sacred medicine, sacred plant that Europeans so-called discovered, appropriated, commodified, and turned into
Right.
something very different and very toxic relative to
Yeah.
the ways that it bound communities in indigenous cultures and throughout the Americas, South, Central, North America. So that's
Yeah.
an excellent contemporary example of how to sort of understand that difference between pure, just sort of commercial or commodified use versus something much more intentional and sacred.
Yeah.
So it's really beautiful. So can you speak a bit more about the sort of plans for the Center for Psychedelic Public Health and where you're seeing things going in the coming months, years, decades?
Yeah, yeah. Big plans. We've got big plans. Well, so our core strategy right now is about taking the approach that this is a new discipline. And so we're making sure that we keep movement going in that, and that's through movement building tools. Our great aspiration is to have a summit where we really bring people together to co-create this field that's just best practice and is a chance to really bring in Indigenous voices, voices from people who've been impacted by the war on drugs, in particular communities of color, people front lines in community-based work, but also the researchers and scientists and educators and policymakers and just the public health practitioners and their institutions, be they health departments or nonprofits or the national systems. So we really aspire to bring people together in a kind of big formal way. And in the meantime, we want to just get it going. So we're planning to start hosting a monthly online. We're taking a page out of the book of the Real World Psychedelic Consortium that alternates months because it's a global audience. And so it's at 9 a.m. Pacific time and 4 p.m. Pacific time, alternating months, so that wherever you are in the world, there's something for you that's like more accessible. And just creating a meeting space. And it's a great chance for us to not just bring people together, but to really define what does it mean to be a psychedelic public health professional? Like, what's our constitution? And so we're thinking about, of course, exchange around work and research and practice being a component of it, but also like focusing on success and focusing on the joy of collaboration and the beauty that's created, and having that be kind of a core ethos that runs through people who carry this work forward in the name of psychedelic public health. So we really see that monthly gathering place as a way to not just build community and build momentum and concentrate power so we can be more potent in this space and bring all the good tools that we have to bear for this mission, but also to say that how we do it really matters. And I think that's another place where it intersects with Indigenous frames, that you can't operate without integrity and be in alignment with the substances, or or be in right relationship with Indigenous knowledge and communities, for example. And thinking about that is also a chance to look at what's our epistemological frame. Like public health currently is guided like by a health for all motto. And it makes me wonder, like, what if psychedelic public health was health for all life? And that's like a subtle fifth, one word. And yet suddenly what we're here for is more expansive, more holistic, more ecological, more in alignment with Indigenous wisdom of how to be in a good way in the world. So that community building, where I think, are getting going with a newsletter also. So these are things that we can just do right now that will start to build momentum. And because momentum is building, and now it's time to make sure that it has a strong foundation. So we're going to work on a glossary project, which I hope you'll be, at the forefront in that, to really create the common language and what's possible through having a shared language. And this might be a living document, but it will put the words in there that matter. And so, of course, all the obvious words around what are the substances and what do they do, and et cetera, but also like biopiracy, like if public health is going to work in this space, we need to know what that means and what's at stake, because that's a driver of access and resources. And those contribute to the social determinants of health, which underlie everything and are central to public health. And then we are wanting to really look at infrastructure and workforce. So looking at health bureaucracies, in particular health departments, we have an aspiration to do a needs assessment for the health departments in the US that are in the states that now have policy reform that's underway. And in many instances, the health departments, which are the main implementing body, haven't been at the table for policy development, and they haven't been brought along in terms of, education and training and what are the toolkits that they need to really bring this forward. And so even when they do come, it's later in the process, which doesn't put them well situated to really unleash all that they're able to provide, and to take an integrated approach where we integrate psychedelic tools throughout their existing structure. It's instead of adding on like a office or a desk in a regulatory setting. And then it also, by not taking care of those elements in advance, it then leaves the personnel, the workforce who work in the psychedelic space in those institutions kind of isolated, like they've got to build bridges. Where's their desk? Where is it? Is it in the right place? Do other people understand? And when you're doing work that other people don't understand, it's rough. It's rough on the individual and their well-being, and it's rough in terms of really getting efficiency and scale brought to bear. So that's
Well,
another area that we care about.
it's nice to see in the U.S. system the fact that states, the state level ballot initiatives or local legislation, they can create natural experiments and build up, maybe by trial and error, at least some workforce capacity in sort of health departments that then can help other states as they come along, perhaps to consider the same types of changes, and learn from
Yeah.
those who've already got some experience, even if there's some growing pains along the way. Ultimately,
Yeah.
there's lots of opportunity in there. So good to hear that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Center for
Yeah.
Psychedelic Public Health is involved in that.
And to keep a global focus, those of us who've co-founded this, and not all, but many of the people are in the US right now, but our intention is to really always have a global perspective. And so like in designing this, we want to have an eye toward health ministries, in global context. And there's certainly a through line, again, with the common denominator of bureaucracy, and underfunding and silos and departments, there's sort of some threads that can be woven together that will make this a tool that we hope can be applied in many different settings. And then similarly with the workforce, that might be called different things, but community health workers and public health nurses exist throughout the world. And they are really important frontline care providers that we think we should really pay attention to for training from pre and post to also specific work in the journey space as well, because they're embedded in communities. They speak the language, they know the cultures. A lot of what is creating like really problematic bottlenecks in the medical model relate to that, the difficulty of cultural translation, the lack of inclusion in psychedelic science. So this public health workforce, I think, is also like a really key place to put attention as one of the solving strategies for the model-based challenges of the biomedical approach. Not that we need that approach too, and it's a yes and.
Yeah.
And
Well,
then,
I think that's
and then of course, community-based care too is where our heart is, and work for peace. And so we've got a few things brewing in those camps as well.
and your work cut out for you. Um, Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap it up here. We're coming close to the end of our time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me and sharing your experience and your wisdom. It's been nice to have you here.
Yeah, it's just always a delight. I'm just so inspired by your dedication over time, and your facility with the language to bring precision that really matters and has a substantive impact, and also being one of the first contributors in this space. So it's just a delight and an honor to always be in collaboration with you. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll end it here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
The content in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended to provide medical advice, diagnose, treat, or prevent any disease. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making decisions about your health or the use of any substances discussed here. Psychedelic substances remain illegal in many jurisdictions. Listeners and viewers are responsible for knowing and complying with the laws in their area. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts or affiliated organizations. If you choose to explore these topics, please do so with caution, respect, and awareness.